So I think we're ready to start. I don't see anyone else in the waiting room. Let me start by welcoming everyone to the EGPP seminar series and to our first session in this academic year. For those who join us for the first time, my name is Daniele Caramani and I'm the director of the European Governance and Politics program at the UI, and I will be chairing the session today. Also, as an information, the EGPP seminar series was introduced a year ago to present and discuss work on European politics, both domestic and at EU level, by established scholars and by junior researchers. And the series combines different types of seminars, so research seminars, but also book presentations and seminars by the EU Studies Working Group, which is organized by EUI researchers, as well as the Conversations for the Future of Europe, which is organized by Philippe Van Parijs. And you can find information and the program for the current semester on our website, the EGPP website. But basically, seminars take place every 2 weeks, and it's always on a Wednesday between 12:30 and 2 p.m. We are still on Zoom today, and we hope that we will be able to move to a hybrid format soon, but restrictions still apply at the UI, which makes it quite difficult. Now, today's session is a research seminar, and we're very fortunate to have Siyana Timcheva as the first presenter of the semester with a paper on ideological cleavages beyond the nation state. And Siyana just completed her PhD at the University of Zurich on these topics with a research monograph from which she has also produced a number of papers. So thank you very much for being with us, Siyana. In spite of being on Zoom, I've no doubt that it will be an engaging seminar, and we very much look forward to your presentation. In terms of format, Siyana will give an initial presentation between 30 and 40 minutes, and then we go straight to Q&A for questions and comments. And to those attending, please keep your microphones muted, but if possible, if your connection is strong enough, keep the video switched on. And then during Q&A, you can use either the hand function if you want to make a comment or write directly in the chat. So thank you all for being with us today, and especially to our speakers. Siyana, please, the floor is yours. If you like to share your screen, feel free.
Thank you, Daniele, for the introduction and above all for the invitation. Let me quickly share my screen. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. So first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for doing such a great job organizing this speaker series. I'm very happy to be here with you today, and although remotely, I will have the opportunity to present my research to you. This paper is a part of my dissertation that I recently defended, as Daniela just told you. The title is Ideological Cleavages Beyond the Nation State, Emergence of Transnational Political Groups and Voting Alliances in International Parliaments. Let me first walk you through the agenda for the presentation. I will first introduce the topic and show you the theoretical framework that I have used to answer my research questions. And then I'm going to present the results from my empirical analysis. They are in two parts. First, I'm going to talk about the emergence of transnational political groups, and then about voting alliances in international parliaments. And I will wrap up my presentation with summarizing the results and talking about their implications. All right. So since the 1950s, the number of international parliaments has grown significantly. And this development poses many questions, but what I became fascinated with is how these new institutions organize. We often presume that national interests, and therefore territorial cleavage, dominate international relations and determine the institutional design of international organizations. Therefore, the expectation is that international parliaments would also organize according to a national logic. And indeed, the majority of them do just that. As you can see on the right graph, from 57 international parliaments in total worldwide, close to 40 organize international delegations. There are a few others that are also organized based on a territorial cleavage and have formed regional blocs. However, in my research, I discovered that there are 13 special parliaments that decided for another organizational logic. So instead of sitting according to their nationality or the region they're coming from, the MPs there chose to create transnational political groups, or TPGs as I call them, and built these groups based on their ideological affiliations and come together as socialists, conservatives, or liberals. So what are these institutions? Since transnational political groups have never been analyzed before comparatively, my first step was to define what they are. So my definition of a TPG within an international parliament is an organized group of parliamentarians remaining relatively stable over time. And this is to distinguish TPGs from any other ad hoc groupings in international parliaments. And these groups are also based on the ideological affiliations of their members, to separate them from groups that unite on a particular issue only. And finally, they are comprised of parliamentarians coming from more than one member state of the parliament. So to exclude the cases where the members of the group are coming from a single state. On the right side, here you can see some examples of TPGs. For instance, the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, or the Center Group at the Nordic Council. So based on my definition, presently, there are close to 50 TPGs in these 13 international parliaments represented here by the black dots on the graph. While many of the international parliaments with political groups are European, there are also two such parliaments in Latin America. These are the Parlasur and Parlacen. And additionally, there are a few parliaments with cross-regional membership, like the Parliament of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, that have also opted to organize into political groups. Here's the same graph broken down by political families. It basically reveals how the ideological makeup of transnational political groups has evolved over the last 70 years. While back in the 1950s, only the old traditional ideologies like the socialists, the Christian Democrats, and the liberals were represented in international parliaments, today TPGs are more ideologically diverse and cover the entire political spectrum. It is also interesting that TPGs mirror domestic developments. For instance, the 1960s saw the emergence of a post-materialist cleavage at the domestic level that triggered the establishment of Green parties. A decade later, the Greens started organizing in international parliaments as well by building political groups. Again, similarly to the domestic level, the political family that has gained most traction in recent decades is the radical right. Nowadays, there are 5 international parliaments that have a radical right political group. And the last such TPG formed actually in 2020 in the Benelux parliament, uniting far-right parties from Belgium and the Netherlands. The graph basically suggests that TPGs follow the ideological trends from domestic politics. So with this background in mind, we can come back to the puzzle the paper attempts to solve. If we presume that ideology is irrelevant beyond the nation state and territorial cleavages determine the design of international organizations, how can we account for the rise of transnational political groups? So it was their paradoxical existence that inspired my research, and motivated by this puzzle, I set out to answer the following research questions. First of all, why do TPGs emerge? And second, what types of voting alliances form in international parliaments where there are political groups? In other words, how do the members of TPGs vote? Do they form alliances according to their ideological affiliations, or do they maybe stick to a national logic? Because it could very well be that TPGs are only symbolic institutions with no real impact on political outcomes. Moreover, beyond the well-researched case of the European Parliament, the voting patterns in no other international parliament have been analyzed before, so there was a clear gap in the literature. The paper attempts to contribute to both comparative politics and international relations, since the topic is at the intersection of both disciplines, and it does so through analyzing a new topic that has never been explored before, and through formulating a novel theory that is also tested with original data. Okay, so to answer the first research question and understand why transnational political groups emerge, I turn to what we know about political party formation in the domestic context. The literature gives us two answers to the question, why parties? The first one is that parties appear to politicize deep societal divisions called cleavages and represent citizens along these cleavages. The second one says that parties are not really rooted in societal conflicts, but rather exist to facilitate the legislative process by resolving collective action problems. I took these two theoretical perspectives and applied them to the international level to explain why transnational political groups exist. And I argue for a version of a cleavage account with an emphasis on membership homogeneity. The idea is that homogeneity between the member states of the international parliament is necessary for transnational political groups to develop. And membership homogeneity is theorized along three dimensions. First, similar political systems. Second, similar economic development levels. And third, the members of the parliament should come from the same region in order for parliament to be considered homogeneous. So geographical proximity is the third dimension. Here is the causal mechanism linking the macro and the micro levels. When the membership of the parliament is homogeneous in terms of the three dimensions, political systems, economic development, and geographical proximity, the MPs delegated to the parliament have compatible ideologies. They are coming from societies with similar social structures, where similar cleavages shape the domestic political competition. Moreover, at the home front, they are used to organizing on ideological basis. Once in the parliament, the MPs socialize with like-minded parliamentarians from their sister parties, and their ideological identity basically comes to the fore. And as a consequence from socializing with other MPs adhering to the same ideology, like-minded MPs start organizing along political lines, which culminates in the establishment of transnational political groups. So my first hypothesis reads, the more homogeneous the membership of the international parliament, the more likely for TPGs to emerge. However, as mentioned before, there is a second plausible explanation. TPGs could also be the result of institutional incentives from within the parliament, in line with the institutionalist account for party formation. Applying rational choice theory to international parliament, I formulate different institutional incentives related to the number of member states, the constitutional status, the parliament's scope and powers that could potentially influence the decision to organize into political groups or not. So first of all, The number of member states in the parliament is one such factor. An increasing number of states makes collective action harder to achieve, and centralized bargaining structures like political groups could solve this problem. Therefore, the more member states that the parliament has, the more likely for political groups to develop. The constitutional status of the parliament can also influence the outcome. The argument here is that international parliaments that are affiliated with an international organization are more likely to establish political groups compared to independent parliaments. And this is the case because when there is an executive to question and control, transnational ideological divisions are more likely to evolve than in a situation where such incentives are not present. Another factor is related to the scope of the parliament. Political ideology is a complex system of beliefs that bundles preferences on many issues. And in that sense, the creation of political groups should be less likely in parliaments that concentrate on fewer issues and have a very narrow scope. Contrarily, a broad scope of the parliament should facilitate the creation of ideological alignments. And finally, how powerful the parliament is could also influence the decision to create political groups or not. Ideological alignments reduce the ability of the member states to control the parliament, since they, because the political groups represent non-territorial interests, and thus in cases where the parliament is more powerful and its decisions are binding for the member states, TPGs should be less likely to emerge due to the sovereignty apprehensions of the member states. Here is the causal mechanism. Basically, the institutional incentives, along with the objective need to organize the parliamentary work, lead MPs to react to those incentives and form political groups. Therefore, hypothesis 2 is the stronger the institutional incentives from within the parliament, the more likely the emergence of political groups. In a second step in the theory building, I tried to extend the homogeneity argument to the behavior of transnational political groups after they are institutionalized. Using the logic of exit voice theory, I argue that under homogeneous membership, the parliamentarians have similar ideologies and preferences, and that, coupled with the socialization within their political group, leads to the development of ideological group identity and loyalty. And in turn, this identity and loyalty finds an expression in high group voting cohesion. So in such parliaments, I expect that the voting alliances are ideological instead of based on national belonging. And my third hypothesis is therefore, if an international parliament has homogeneous membership, then the transnational political groups are likely to show high group voting cohesion. So with all the theory in place, we can now move on to my empirical analysis. The first empirical part of my paper attempts to answer the question, why do TPGs emerge? And to test that, it's obviously not enough to concentrate on the 13 positive cases, and therefore I employed a large N setup to explore the variation between parliaments with and without political groups. The data for the analysis is time series cross-sectional on 53 international parliaments for the period between 1945 and 2017. The dependent variable is binary, existence or not of TPGs in a year. The independent variables operationalize both the cleavage and the rational choice accounts. The method for the analysis is logistic regression due to the binary dependent variable. And in addition to the main model, I estimated 6 alternative models to check the robustness of the results. The robustness checks explore alternative operationalizations of some variables, excluding outlier cases, using censored version of the data, etc. Let me also show you how I operationalize the independent variables. So starting with the membership homogeneity variables, in how far the political systems of the member states are similar to each other is measured through the standard deviation in their polity 4 scores. The similarity in terms of economic development as the standard deviation in GDP per capita across the member states. And geographical proximity is measured with a binary variable recording whether a parliament has regional or cross-regional membership. The institutional account variables, and the first one is pretty straightforward. It's simply the number of member states over time. The constitutional status is operationalized through another binary, which distinguishes between independent parliaments and such that are affiliated with an international organization. I measure the scope of the parliament through the number of parliamentary committees over time. And finally, the powers with another binary that distinguishes between parliaments with no powers at all and such that have at least consultative powers. Turning to the results led support mainly to the cleavage account for TPG formation. As you see, 2 of the 3 homogeneity dimensions, so homogeneity in terms of political systems and in terms of economic development, are significant and in the expected direction. From the institutional variables, only the affiliation to an international organization is significant. And next, I will give you a glance at the magnitude of the results. So the first dimension of homogeneity that proved to have a significant effect relates to the political systems of the member states. The compatibility of the member states' political regimes is measured with the standard deviation in the polity 4 score, as I just told you. And as the graph indicates, the larger the standard deviation, so the more different the political systems, the lower the predicted probability of TPG existence. The second homogeneity dimension pertains to the similarity between the member states in terms of economic development. It is again measured. It is measured as the standard deviation in GDP per capita, and as expected, we see a significant negative relationship. The more the countries diverge in their economic development levels, the less likely it is that they will build political groups in the international parliament they participate in. One of the institutional variables also turned out to be significant. So parliaments that are affiliated to an international organization are more likely to develop TPGs compared to independent ones. And the results therefore indicate that institutional variables can also influence the creation of TPGs. Now, this finding led me to formulate a 2-step explanation for the emergence of transnational political groups that basically reconciles the cleavage and the institutional accounts. Although these 2 explanations are usually viewed as competing accounts in the domestic context, my results show that they can be integrated, at least in the context of international parliaments. And according to my 2-step mechanism, homogeneity between the member states is a structural prerequisite for the formation of political groups, but nevertheless, next to the structural factors, institutional factors like the affiliation to an international organization can moderate the relationship. Turning to the second empirical part of the paper, it attempts to answer the question about the voting alliances in international parliaments with political groups. And I address this question through two cases of international parliaments that have established TPGs. And these cases are the Nordic Council and the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. The purpose is to test the last hypothesis about the expected voting cohesion levels. As you probably remember, the theory predicts that under homogeneous membership, TPGs would vote cohesively and along political lines, whereas under heterogeneous membership, they are expected to be less cohesive and voting should follow national lines. The data for the analysis comes from two regional roll call vote datasets for the period between 2015 and 2019. In both cases, all votes that took place in that period are recorded. And in terms of methods, I use ideal point estimation models, more particularly optimal classification and W-nominate to analyze the voting patterns in the two parliaments. Let me show you something about the case selection strategy. It entails two diverse cases of international parliaments with political groups that are as different as possible on the three membership homogeneity dimensions formulated in the theory. So the first case is the Nordic Council. Its member states are all democracies, have very similar levels of economic development, and all five come from the same region. They're basically Scandinavian countries. The second case is the oldest European Parliament, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, where the membership is starkly heterogeneous. It currently has 47 member states, a quarter of which are non-democracies. Moreover, the member states have different economic development levels and come from different regions. So let's start with the results from the voting patterns analysis in the case of the Nordic Council. These are the ideal points of MPs in the Nordic Council estimated with optimal classification. The first plot shows the ideal points plotted by national delegations. As you see on the graph basically looks very messy and there are no recognizable patterns. Visibly, there are no patterns whatsoever of voting blocks based on nationality in the homogeneous Nordic Council. However, when we look at the same ideal points plotted by political groups, clear patterns of ideological voting crystallize. The political groups in the Nordic Council are highly cohesive, and moreover, the location of the political groups in the recovered space indicates that they vote along a left-right dimension. Just as one would expect, the Nordic Green Left occupies the most left positions, followed by the Social Democrats. The center group is the least cohesive, but is nevertheless located in the middle of the political space. The Conservatives are to be found on the right of the political spectrum, along with the Nordic Freedom Group, occupying the most right positions. And this is no surprise, given that this political group is made up of MPs from radical right parties. So let's move on to the second case, the case of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, or the PASE. Here, the expectation is that voting would follow non-ideological alignments due to the diverse membership. And this is exactly what we find when plotting the MP's ideal points. The two clusters that transpire indicate that the first dimension of competition in the PASE is a conflict between democracies on the one hand and non-democracies on the other. The voting alliances in this international parliament seem to be determined primarily by political regime type. Zooming into the cluster of MPs from non-democratic states, we see that parliamentarians from the same country cluster very closely together. Especially the representatives from Turkey, Russia, and Azerbaijan have ideal points that are almost overlapping at times. So it seems that the nationality of the MPs determines the way they vote in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. And MPs from non-democracies consistently have different preferences compared to their counterparts coming from democratic states. But what happens if we plot all ideal points by political groups? Interestingly, the political groups also cluster together, but on the second dimension. Their relative location on the second dimension is exactly as we would expect. The MPs of the United European Left occupied the most left positions, followed by the Socialist group, and both these groups are quite cohesive in their voting. The members of the Liberal group, the ALDE, are located mostly in the middle, although their ideal points are much more dispersed. The same is true for the European People's Party group and the Conservatives. So even in the least likely case of an international parliament with such heterogeneous membership, like the PASE, ideology is not completely irrelevant. All right, so in conclusion, what are the main takeaway messages from my paper? Well, first of all, transnational political groups seem to emerge from similar domestic cleavages and not simply from institutional incentives. And second, when the membership of the International Parliament is homogeneous, we observe highly cohesive political groups and ideological voting. In other words, under homogeneous membership, ideology trumps nationality. However, when the member states of the parliament are heterogeneous, non-ideological divisions crystallize. So to sum up, the overarching conclusion is that membership homogeneity is relevant not only for the institutionalization of political groups, but also for the observed behavior of their members. My findings have various implications. First of all, on the normative side, if transnational political groups are rooted in societies and are a product of domestic cleavages, they have the potential to provide citizen instead of state representation in international parliaments. They can be the actors that supply truly democratic representation beyond the nation state, which is often lacking. Second, based on the results, we can also say that transnational political groups are not just symbolic institutions. They influence political outcomes within international parliament, and in that sense, they also have an impact on integration. And finally, my research suggests that although considered irrelevant outside the boundaries of the state, ideology is making its way to the international realm, and there is an ideological cleavage beyond the nation state, and the TPGs are just one manifestation of this process. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your comments and questions.
Very good, excellent. Thank you very much, Siyana, for your presentation, for also for sticking to the time. Maybe you can leave the slides. You can continue to share the screen in case some of the comments we would like to refer to, if
Sure.
you don't mind.
Yeah.
And with this, I think we can open the Q&A for questions and comments. Please raise your hand or write into the chat. Gary, please go ahead.
Okay, very interesting. Someone has to go first. Very interesting presentation, and a very interesting topic. you know, it's one of those presentations I'd love to actually see the paper and really come to grips with it, but you gave a very good presentation, very clear. I have just a few questions relating to the portfolio, the policy portfolio of an IO, and the extent to which the Parliament and non-intergovernmental actors exert authority, are able to exert authority in the organization. And it just so happens that, I don't know, you probably know this, that we have a data set which covers those topics in some depth. So I'm just wondering, you know, I have some priors without testing them against your data set. But my feeling would be that to the extent that an IO, and therefore the Parliament within an IO, is engaged with issues that have some domestic reverberation, let me put it like that, some domestic content, so one would have a greater coherence of the party groups. And conversely, to the extent that an IO is concerned with international issues, with issues of international power, international relations, generally speaking, intergovernmental issues, so that domestic ideological content would actually be less relevant and less detectable in the Parliament. So I think the policy variation is going to be an interesting kind of additional way of thinking about an independent variable. And then perhaps even kind of more generally, the extent to which the international organization is intergovernmental itself in its decision-making. So, and I think you actually try to capture this, you know, your model, I'm looking at the screen and things are passing quite fast. I think you do actually test this in a bivariate way in your model. That is to say, the extent of supranationalism or intergovernmentalism. And of course, one can be quite kind of refined about that. But I would suspect that the more intergovernmental an organization, the greater the role of national origin in terms of voting patterns. Let me leave it, I've got many other questions, but let me leave it right there, and very interesting topic.
Siyana, if you'd like to respond.
Yes. So about the policy portfolio of the international organization and the extent to which the international parliament exerts influence on the international organization, you're absolutely right that if the content of the issues is more connected to domestic issues, then it's more likely for ideological alignments to thrive in an international parliament. But I think that this is a part of my homogeneity argument. I think that only if the member states are homogeneous, they will talk about and decide on domestic issues in the international parliament. Whereas when you have very heterogeneous membership, the issues will be of more international nature. Does this answer your question?
Yeah, I think it's the beginning of one. I do have a question about the homogeneity, however you pronounce it, variable. And that is, you'd expect some multicollinearity. So you've got economic, you've got, I think probably it must be per capita GDP or GDP. You've got homogeneity with respect to the political system. You're using Polity 4, you could use some other data on that. And then you've got the extent to which an organization is more or less democratic.
Yeah.
And what you'd really want to do, homogeneity is kind of covers a lot of different characteristics. It also covers the confluence of legal systems. It covers the extent to which an organization has a geographical concentration. And above all, it encompasses the sheer number of member states. Now, I know you have some of this separately, but I think, what I would be interesting to get inside is the way in which these, because it's sometimes difficult to pull these apart because of the associations among them. And so, I think it's going to be an interesting challenge, an interesting topic for you. And let me just finish with one other kind of point, and that is, it's a pure question, it's a naive question. Do you have organizations where you get a shift in terms of the existence of a transnational party, a group? And I think those are going to be very interesting cases. Where do you actually find a switch in your dependent variable?
Yeah, thank you so much for the thoughtful comments. I actually have a few such cases, and my favorite one is the Nordic Council, because it was created in the 1950s, and it started off as organized into national delegations, and they had no intentions of changing that. But in the 1970s, they actually decided to switch to political groups. And from my research, from what I gather, is that they did so because the Nordic Council of Ministers was created in the 1970s, almost right after the creation of an executive branch to the organization. They formed political groups, and this is why the affiliation to an international organization is one of my independent variables, because I think that when there is an executive branch to question and to control, the parliamentarians have more incentives to coalesce into political groups. And also it's also for information gain, right? They can learn from their colleagues, from sister parties, and then report back at home about what's happening in that international parliament and also in the other member states. So yes, these are really interesting cases, and this is why one of them is part of my dissertation, just because I was fascinated with the organizational shift 2 decades after the parliament was created.
Thank you. More questions? Ruth?
Yeah, thanks much for the presentation. And I'm definitely not a specialist on this, so take my comments with a grain of salt in that regard. I've got 2 thoughts. The first one is, what is the role of path dependency within organizations in this? And to some extent, the fact that you've got cases where there's change, I guess, responds to that. But I was more thinking of path dependency as a factor when there's new groups being added to the mix. Thinking about the European Parliament, where there were socialist and Christian Democratic and a liberal group already, and then it's an obvious sort of route forward is for the radical right and the Greens to also form a group along ideological lines. And sort of wondering whether there's a way to take that into account. The other point is, and again, you mentioned that there's instances of change. I was wondering if you got any cases where an ideological or an organization along ideological lines falls apart. I think that would be really interesting to have that sort of switch. And I was, in a way, thinking about whether you can link those changes to changes in the independent variables. And one case that I sort of spontaneously thought of was the enlargement of the European Union that adds a lot more homogeneity in terms of member states and the ideologies of those parties. And that, if you're right, that should put some strain on those parliamentary groups so that they might fall apart or are split in blocks that are more regional based, even if there's potentially going to stay some element of ideology in there. But really interesting talk. Thanks for that.
Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you very much for your questions. Regarding the first one about the path dependency, you're absolutely right. And usually when one group starts organizing, the others follow suit. And most often it's the socialists that start organizing, and then the center-right parties organize right after, followed by the liberals, and recently also extreme right and extreme left transnational political groups. So that exists for sure, but I do not measure the number of political groups within a parliament. My dependent variable is only a binary, so whether they are one or many groups or not. So the variable switches in the year when the first one was created. The second question, whether there is a case when there was a reverse change. Actually, yes. The Baltic Assembly started off as organized into political groups, but 10 years later, they figured out that it doesn't make sense because they don't use the political groups that much. So within the parliament, they interacted way more within the national delegations and didn't make use of the groups. And this is why at some point they decided to dismantle them. So there is also such an instance. And finally, regarding the European Parliament not being homogeneous anymore with the enlargements, yes, that's true. At the same time, there is a lot of research showing that political parties across Europe are very similar in terms of their ideology and political programs. In that sense, I would argue that the European Union, and by extension the European Parliament, is not as heterogeneous as it looks like. So that's my answer to this one.
Okay, thanks, Siyana. Lisbeth is next.
Yes, Siyana, thank you for a really stimulating talk there. And I just want to maybe follow up a bit on some of the things that you were discussing with Gary in your conversation with Gary. And one has to do with this, this connection between the policy scope, what the IO does, and how some mechanism of accountability might work, right? And so Gary asked you, have you looked at, whether there's differences depending on what the IO does? I think there's two ways in which I would kind of add to that. One is where you have IOs that explicitly are set up to serve the interests of their members, whatever these might be in the future. IOs that we would call interest or, common concerns of the members. IOs that we would call general purpose IOs,
yeah,
right, where there is no predefined, no contracted limit to what an IO possibly can be asked to take up as a common problem. My guess would be that those IOs would, there would be you could call it almost a functional need. You could always call it very much a political pressure to set up an accountability system, like through a parliament, that is genuinely able to talk back to what the IO does, but also what the member states collectively as governments want it to do. And that context may just be more facilitated, may bring in, as you call, domestic politics more, right? And domestic politics is primarily organized along ideological lines. Territory definitely matters, particularly in federal countries, but ideology really is the driver of how democratic politics is organized. So general purpose versus more task-specific IOs. And here I'm thinking what is, if I understood it correctly, the Benelux actually moved very late in moving from a kind of national-based delegation system to an ideologically based delegation system. Did you say 2020?
No, so the last political group was built in the...
Okay, so they started earlier? Yeah,
They started already in the 50s.
Okay,
Yeah.
so they did. Yeah. Okay. So okay. I was going to connect that with the expansion of what the Benelux does, but I'm not quite getting there, even though the big expansion, of course, was in the 50s, was, you know, the shift from the first treaty to the second treaty. But so that kind of element of, and then the other thing, you know, your element of normative, of homogeneity is something that is very similar to what we argue in our book about where you have a pre-existing community or normative commonality among the members, you're more likely to engage in these more intrusive, you could say, from a national sovereignty perspective, initiatives in transnational governance, as you so very nicely call it, boldly, and I like that very much. So, and I think there's interesting affinity to explore between our notion of normative commonality / community and your notion of homogeneity. And in fact, in terms of operationalization, there's real, there's some significant overlap there. The second point is more a question, and I may have missed that in your presentation, so then set me correct. But I wonder if you could show again for Pache the plots with the two-dimensional plots, the voting plot.
This one or the first one?
That one, yes.
That one. Yeah.
This one. So the first dimension you, I think, correctly see as one that pits democratic against non-democratic countries.
Yeah.
Variation on the second dimension seems to be larger.
Absolutely, and the second dimension explains less of the voting choices. So the first dimension explains more than 95% of voting choices, whereas the second one only adds a few percentage points. So the first
that's
one,
interesting. And so I wonder whether your data are refined enough to maybe split up the vote on types of vote. I mean, I think given that your human rights is so key to the Council of Europe, presumably a lot of votes are about that. And that is, of course, directly linked to democratic versus non-democratic. But I wonder how persistent and consistent that pattern is across perhaps other types of decisions that are being voted on in Pache.
It's exactly as you imagine it. So on political issues and on human rights issues, the difference between MPs coming from democracies and such that are from non-democracies is much larger than on, let's say, social or economic issues, because they also vote on such things. It's not only human rights that they talk about.
Of course, the thing that bites most is human rights, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Most other
things. So you're right.
Which is a nice illustration to link back to my first point to, you know, the policy scope, the kinds of things that the IO does that you know shapes certainly the way these parliaments are going to vote and how votes will line up, but also most likely their organization.
Yeah, regarding that, I actually tried to use your variables, the general purpose versus task-specific IOs. The problem is that not all my parliaments are attached to an international organization. So in my data set, I have 33, I believe, that are attached to an IO, but the rest are not.
Which is fascinating. I think that is really interesting that you have these transnational bodies, you know, apart from an institutionalized governance structure.
Yeah, so this was the problem of using this operationalization, that I do not have. I have also independent parliaments, so it didn't work, and therefore for the scope of the parliament, I thought, okay, what is the best way to operationalize what a parliament does? And I thought that the number of parliamentary committees is a good proxy, because the more committees you have, the broader the scope. At least that was my reasoning. It's not true in every instance. Like there are some task-specific parliaments, like, I don't know, the OSCE, Parliamentary Assembly, they have a lot of parliamentary committees, but it's still a very, it's a parliament with a narrow scope. So it doesn't work every time, but I couldn't figure out a better way to operationalize it.
Great, thanks.
Thank you very much. Are there further questions? I don't see any. Maybe maybe I can jump in myself. I was wondering about the path dependence conversation that you had with Ruth. Whether this is really something that one would call path dependence or rather diffusion.
Diffusion, yeah.
Emulation between these groups, and how much it would relate actually to an incentive argument, that if someone starts, you have an incentive to get organized as well, not to be outvoted all the time. But that's a small point. And I was also very interested now in listening, trying to follow the conversation on policy variation between, I mean, it's very difficult to find concrete examples, I think, of an intergovernmental type of vote, or one with domestic reverberations. But I'm sure it's possible to find examples, and I mean, you would have that data. But in a way, it's a conversation that was related to the homogeneity, but it relates also to the scope. So to a more institutional approach, the second one that you use. Now, if I understood correctly, your data allows you to say whether it's a general scope or a more specific one, but not to distinguish a more intergovernmental, a more domestic or transnational type of, is that correct?
Yeah.
Yes, that's obviously well, something that could be done in future research. Now, I have two real questions. I mean, one is on homogeneity, and yes, you have a number of indicators, and you use them to build a cleavage story of transnational groups in international parliaments. But in reality, you never look at cleavage, the homogeneity or the similarity, the conversion of cleavage structure at the domestic level. You could imagine that, in spite of being geographically close to one another, having similar GDP and so on, the domestic cleavage structure are quite different at the parliamentary level, at the voting level, and even at the cabinet level. You could imagine that different dimensions are politicized in certain countries, not in other countries. I mean, the crucial independent variable here would be the similarity of cleavage structure. I mean, for Europe, over time this increases. For other areas, I wouldn't know. But it seems to me that it would be almost a precondition that you have similar cleavage structure at the domestic level to see representatives from these countries then voting ideologically at the supranational level.
Yeah.
And the second question is on the institutional side. And I understand, I mean, you have different indicators, affiliation, yes, whether the parliament is part of an IO or not, and the scope and the power, etc. But, and I mean, I understand that. But your argument is one of incentives, and I don't really see the connection. So what would be the incentives, given these institutional features, to organize ideological? What would be the mechanism that does that?
Okay.
Thanks.
So about the first question, I also agree that it's not really path dependency, but diffusion. And in the robustness checks, in that part of the analysis, I tried to operationalize a diffusion mechanism as well through including a variable that measures the how many international parliaments have already established political groups in a given year. It's a really bad measure, I know, for a diffusion mechanism, but it didn't turn out to be significant. And I think that there is more to the diffusion story that can be explored by future research. When I started working on this, my initial hunch was actually that there is that it's a story about diffusion way more than it is about other things. But at the same time, I think that the homogeneity and the diffusion mechanisms are not really mutually exclusive. So I still believe that homogeneity is a precondition. It's like the structural prerequisite for ideological alignments, and diffusion can only sort of moderate or help that process. The second argument, yes, I do not really measure cleavage structures at the domestic level, and this is only because there is no data for the cleavage structures in each and every country in the world, because I mean, I would have to calculate some measure across the member states of each parliament, and that would really mean to have a good data for pretty much every country in the world, which doesn't exist. So my measures are the best proxy that I could find available for all the cases. That's the truth on this one. And the third question about the institutional incentives, what I mean by that. Well, when let's come back to the scope. When the scope of the parliament is very narrow, and let's say that only human rights issues are discussed, my argument here is that if this is the case, political groups are obsolete. So the MPs will not have an incentive to coalesce into political groups just because ideology is like more complex and involve issues in like a multidimensional space. And when you have a single, like a super issue, it's not enough to find common ground on and develop ideological alignments. In that sense, I talk about incentives. You know, that one institutional design creates one set of incentives and another a different one. And some designs make MPs more susceptible to building political groups, whereas others don't. Does this make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. Thank you. Thanks. So the floor is still open. If someone, yes, Gary, please go ahead.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question in terms of the kind of the mechanisms. You know, what's going on in terms of the, you know, what is the kind of the precise logic of the creation of one of a party group system at the transnational level in a parliament. Now there's an argument. I mean, I'm not sure exactly how it fits into your research, but one argument about ideology is that it is a kind of a shortcut.
Yep.
That is to say, if you have an array of policies that are on the table, you find some way of simplifying your position vis-a-vis each and every one of them. And so that's you'd have to say the conventional, or actually this is a Downesian notion, but many others from other perspectives take the same position. It's a kind of a economy of mental effort, if you like.
Yeah.
Now, you have to think in terms of the incentives, that when one group starts to do this, or when some actors in a parliament, when some legislators start to coagulate with respect to their ideology, that this actually provides an incentive for others to do the same, right? There's a kind of a logic of group formation and counter group formation. So I think it's a very interesting question to try to get inside, the mechanisms that, and in a way, I think what you're doing is you're trying to do this from a kind of a more aggregate perspective in terms of the aggregate characteristics of that set of member states that are participants, or that the characteristics of the organization itself. And I think it's a very, I think the question Daniel is putting on the table is an important one, to translate that into the particular incentives that actors will have to do this. And so, I would be drawn to the view that where the issues relate to issues that these actors deal with in the domestic context, where there's a wide variety of issues that confront them, so they will kind of bring in, as a kind of an economy, as it were, the ideological premises that they have in the domestic level, and therefore also the alliances or coalitions that they have across by virtue of party family. And party family is precisely such a shortcut with respect to putting legislators in particular groups.
Yeah.
Siyana, can I add something, because I think
Of course.
turn a bit move into a conversation mode, but I think the comparison with national parliaments can be quite useful in making certain distinctions. And the question really is, why parties? Why do we have parties? I mean, you could see this ideological, the transnational groups, a bit like proto parties that form. So ideological contiguity, similarity, and so on. At the national level, at the very early stage of parliamentarism, it was a similar situation. You had these districts, most cases, in all cases actually, a single member, long before proportional representation was introduced, and you would have one or two, or maybe sometimes three representatives for each of these districts, and it could have stayed like that. Like now you have states represented in these parliaments. You had constituencies represented, territorial units represented in these national parliaments. But these people start coordinating, they start to link, and I mean the literature on the nationalization of politics really shows this linkage cross-district. So it's a cross-district coordination between people that, what do they have in common? They come from different places, they represent people who probably, I don't know, the constituency of Birmingham, the constituency of Manchester, they've never seen each other. Why do they start coordinating? Why do they link up in a political party? Because they represent similar interests. and that's, if you want, this is a deterritorialization of, and that's why the distinction between territorial cleavages and ideological or functional cleavages is so important. It applies to this level as well. But where the incentive is that at the national level, I mean, all this is structural. It's cleavage-based. It's the rock and stuff. But the rational choice account says that this happens because these people want to capture national cabinet. Now, you don't have that at the supranational level with these parliaments. And that's why I thought, where is the incentive? You know, where is the incentive? I mean, if you want, it's a policy-oriented kind of, it's not an office seeking kind of argument that you have. It's a policy seeking one, and rather than an office seeking. And I would tend to associate rational choice and incentives and all that kind of argument with office seeking.
You're right that it does not really apply in my case. And regarding the comparison to the national level, I use that analogy with the national level throughout the paper and also in my dissertation. As you know, I also find it very useful, and basically my inspiration for the theory was the literature on the nationalization of political parties. So I also see the connection between the two. I have to think about how to change the like, maybe not talking about incentives would be better when discussing the rational choice or the institutionalist account. Do you think this would remedy the problem, or?
I don't know, it's complicated.
No? It's complicated?
But maybe someone else has. Gary.
Well, look, I've got a question for the group, and really for Daniele in particular. So, you know, the creation of parties, yeah, you've got representatives elected in disparate districts across the country. But as we move into the era of mass politics, and particularly the era of social democracy, what we then have are parties that are formed entirely and utterly outside parliaments. So the social democratic parties exist as movements, and then they try to figure out where they can penetrate, in a sense, the extant institutional system. And so they pick on coal mining districts, or they pick on cotton districts. They find some area where they can feel that they can get some plurality, sometimes a majority, but it's a plurality in those districts. And they're already kind of pre-formed. And my sense is that pre-formation might be relevant to what Siyana is talking about, because these groups already exist in parliaments. And so the kind of the John Aldrich model, which was a kind of, in my, you know, it's kind of the US terrain, the presumption of kind of non-ideological fixity, enormous regional diversity, delegates who are representing, I mean, Daniele knows more about this than anyone really, or anyone here for sure. But my sense is that rational choice logic is not really, that these people come already laden, they're already infused, they think of themselves as a socialist, or as a green, or as something else. And so I feel that they naturally, actually, I once had a chat with Juan Lentz about the European Parliament and the empowerment of the European Parliament. And Juan turned around to me, I think it was actually here at the UI some years ago, and said, Gary, I'm really concerned about this Parliament. It's going to establish and institutionalize and reinforce nationalism. When you scratch a German socialist, they are going to be German and not socialist. And I didn't kind of respond much to that. But precisely the opposite thing happened.
Mhm.
And that is in the European Parliament. I mean, Simon and others have done so much research on this. It is the ideological position that determines how they vote in the vast range of votes. And it's not the national identity is a kind of a residual and not even a very major one. And so I have to feel, that my kind of premise going into international parliaments is that there would be this ideological kind of formation, and that that national identity is really going to be there in the Council of Ministers kind of format. I think you probably find that, Siyana, too, that even where you get, where you do get IOs where they have an intergovernmental body, that is going to be very, people have argued that there is an ideological element there too, that the socialists coalesce and so forth, but it's going to be mostly intergovernmental. And I'm just wondering if there is what are the parliaments that are going to be mostly kind of national in their voting performance.
May I say something, or Daniela, you want to answer?
No.
Actually, as I showed on one of the first slides, the majority, more than 2/3 of international parliaments actually organize according to a national logic. And it's only 13 that have opted for ideological divisions. So it's still the national interest prevails within international parliaments, although you would expect the opposite. Daniela, did you want to answer?
No. I find the discussion very interesting, but I don't want to. I don't want to take too much space. I want to ask if there are other questions or points or rejoiners, even those who have already spoken. We still have a bit of time. If not, Siyana, would you have some concluding remarks, or do you think we covered?
Most of all, I would like to thank everyone for attending my talk and for the very thoughtful comments and questions, and I will do my best to implement at least some of them in the next version of this paper.
Thank you, Siyana. Now it's for us to thank you for presenting a very interesting research and for the stimulating and engaging session. Good luck with the paper and
thank you.
Papers. And thank you everyone for your participation, for attending, and for the discussion. So we reconvene in 2 weeks' time with another research seminar where Lorenzo Cicchi and myself will present conceptualization of our current research on the impact of COVID-19 on the European cleavage structure. And hopefully we will see many of you again for another interesting session. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you very much again, Siyana. Thank you very much, everyone, and see you hopefully in 2 weeks' time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Siyana.
You're welcome.